Welcome to Kanata Connections. I'm David Watts. I am Kanata, and I, that is we. Villages of life that stretch from sea to sea to sea. A human constellation, as long as the rivers run. Kanata, Kanacha, Canadien, we are Canadian. Unlike our southern neighbor and two of our European colonizing parent states, inhabitants of the Kanata constellations have placed greater emphasis on connection than on freedom as our preeminent value. This applies as much to indigenous peoples as to later arrivals, and it has a lot to do with the need to hang together to survive in the face of an unforgiving winter climate. This coherence applies at three levels: that of the village itself, in constellations of villages that became confederations, and ultimately in our connection with our fellow human beings and life on this planet. In ranking connection ahead of freedom, we are not making an either-or choice, but recognizing the reality that, outside of community, no freedom exists except in solitude. Indigenous bands, especially nomadic peoples who hunted the bison on the plains, had as great or greater freedom in their villages as settler peoples that came after, with decision-making by consensus and accountable leadership. If an individual or family was not at one with the group, they could move to another village. If they tried to work against the consensus, they could be forced to move, expelled, or if they had sufficient support, the village might divide. A similar fluidity played within indigenous confederacies: the 5, and for a time 6 nations of the Iroquois, and the 3 of the Blackfoot, with an equal number of allies. Both alliances extended south-north across what is now the Canada-US border, which they still cross by right. A third, the Nihia people, named Cree by the French for the sound of their language, was more diffuse. Before contact, they spread west from Quebec to the Rockies, becoming an almost transcontinental constellation of plains, wood, swampy, and mountain Cree, each nation adapted to its own environment, sharing a subarctic orientation and using canoes on streams and rivers. They provided guides for French and Scots traders and parented the Métis Nation. The routes they paddled established the foundations for today's Kanata constellation. In 7 Rivers of Canada, Hugh McLennan points out that we have a second country in North America for one reason. The Americans in Paris, negotiating independence from Britain in 1783, did not know of this east-west network of waterways crossing the north of the continent. The delegates were determined, in setting their northern border, to break the back of remaining British power in North America. They considered the rock of the Canadian Shield impenetrable and did not concern themselves with passages there might be north of Lake Superior. They knew the Hudson's Bay Company holdings on the plain were accessed through Churchill. These, like the St. Lawrence, were impassable much of the year. They knew that west of the Great Lakes, the lower plains and Fort Garry were accessible by and from the Red River that flowed from south of 49 into Canada, continuing through Lakes Winnipeg and Manitoba and into Hudson's Bay. The west to east, south and north Saskatchewan were part of this drainage system. As Louis Riel's Red River later regime, provisioned from the U.S. side, was encouraged to join the Union, the American delegates assumed that Britain's remaining possessions north of the border would eventually fall like ripe fruit into their basket without a shot being fired. 10 years after the Paris Peace, Alexander Mackenzie painted his name on a rock at Bella Bella, BC, and From Canada by Land, 1793. This was mission accomplished to Jacques Cartier's assignment 239 years before, when the explorer named the river west of Montreal La Chine, China, the goal of his commission from François Premier. Canadian Pacific's first deep-sea steamship, the Empress of India, arrived in Canada from China and Japan 98 years later, completing a Northwest Passage link between Europe and Asia with land portage across North America. The third level of our Kanata connection trait, to fellow human beings and to life on this planet, is shared by both First Nations and later arrivals. It is evident in Turtle Island creation mythology that even when punctuated by internation warfare, does not appear to have had the millennia-plus rifts that have existed among Westerners over differences in religion. This connecting impulse continued after contact, as the railway building a trade passage from Europe to Asia imported laborers from both continents, some who stayed to lay the footings of a multicultural Northwest Passage that would be recognized 90 years later. On a 1939 visit to Canada, the first time a reigning monarch came here, George VI foresaw this when he reached Victoria, BC, looked out on the Pacific, and said that the day would come in a more peaceful world when Canada would be a human bridge between the two old worlds of Asia and Europe. And so it is, with our two largest coastal provinces populated by settlers of two of these empires. In British Columbia, beginning with our first Chinatown in Victoria, people of Chinese ancestry may be in the majority by the end of this century. In Quebec, descendants of the French Empire that dominated Europe until 1759 have been in the majority for 4 centuries. For Kanata, the village constellation, connection is our lifeblood, and isolation does not appear to be an option. From the singular blonde Mohawk who gave his name to Yellowhead Pass, to Mike Pearson who proposed the first United Nations peacekeeping force, and John Diefenbaker and Brian Mulroney who led Commonwealth sanctions against a fellow settler state blocking human connection with apartheid policies, to the two Michaels, Spaver and Kovrig, who were on humanitarian exchanges, the list is endless. Why should we compare ourselves adversely with so-called great powers or lament the many decisions that affect us that are taken elsewhere? Since contact, politically and economically, the Kanata constellation has always been a satellite or a pass-through for other powers. This gives us an accessibility not possible to those who see themselves as self-sufficient. In the years before the United States and the People's Republic of China would talk to each other, they would talk to Canada, and we passed their messages along. So we were able to be good listeners, as long as we don't let that go to our heads as some kind of virtue. One example of this type of go-between, forgotten now, was diplomat Chester Ronning, who assisted in the wind-down of the Vietnam War. He was born to missionary parents in China and spent his last years in Alberta. For his 90th birthday, his daughter and others of the family took him back to the village where he was born and grew up. She told this story, as recorded in many Canadian newspapers. At the village that he recognized immediately, at the village well, he asked a local woman a direction to a place that he knew from childhood. Her eyes opened wide. "How is it you speak such perfect Chinese?" she said. "Because I am Chinese," he retorted. "You don't look Chinese." "Perhaps I've lived so long amongst white people that I've started to look like them." Being Canatien is being connected and being open to connection, not of DNA, ancestry, language, or ideology. For Kanata Connections, I'm David Watts.
Kanata, au long des rivières, les villages lumineux au-delà des frontières, a human constellation as long as the rivers run. Kanata, Kanata, Canadien, we are Canadian.